Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm Berit Anderson, the COO of Future in Review. And for those of you who have never heard of Future in Review before, we run the annual FIRE conference, which The Economist has called the best technology conference in the world. The other arm of our business, Strategic News Service, provides its subscribers with the most accurate source of information about the future of technology and the global economy. So if you enjoy these updates, we recommend that you sign up for the Strategic News Service Global Report using the link below. And I'm here today with Berit Anderson, who is a senior analyst for the Global Report and the CEO of Invent IP, our initiative focused on nation-sponsored intellectual property theft. And we're going to be doing a little switcheroo of sorts. He is going to be interviewing me for a change. So I hereby officially, Evan, in this capacity, reprised my role as host.
I can feel the power already.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Berit. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to switch around a little bit. I think this week's issue, just for the audience, you described a number of things that were really interesting and new, all to do with the information sphere inside the US. And one of the things that you talked a lot about and sort of introduced as a concept was information sovereignty, which I thought was really interesting because we don't talk that much about our information spheres, right, as sovereign. So can you kind of just get a little bit into that and tell folks what you're thinking when you're talking about information sovereignty? Like, what does it mean?
Right. So I think for the average person, what it means, the concept of information sovereignty is, do the American people own the national conversation that is taking place within the country? You can ask the same question about any country.
Yeah.
Is it a result of popular beliefs and ideas rising up as we are told through algorithms? Or is it a result of foreign interference? And I think the idea of information sovereignty is you are primarily experiencing a conversation that is legitimately from the minds, hearts, and souls of the American people. But what we're experiencing in America right now, and what I write about in this piece, is that the conversations that we are having on a national level right now as citizens are not actually designed or orchestrated by Americans. They're heavily manipulated and influenced by both the Chinese Communist Party and Russian misinformation. And what that means is that we think we're having these conversations that are about political polarity and we're very divided, but really those divides are being accelerated and exacerbated by this outside interference. And so a lot of this frustration and anger that we're feeling about how much we really hate people on the other side of the aisle and how much we, whatever side of the aisle you're on, it's likely you feel pretty bad about people who think differently politically than you do right now. And that is by design. So that's kind of the overall concept of information sovereignty here in the US.
Yeah, and you what you're getting at too is, not only who controls the conversation, but also what people believe that conversation to be. So not like, in other words, not only I believe you're saying not only are we losing control of our national conversation, and for instance, this is an older problem, but not in its current iteration, where in the past people had lots of propaganda that they tried to insert into the US. Much of it worked, but if it came on a flyer, it spread a heck of a lot slower than if it, and was less convincing than it may look now when it looks like our own countrymen believe something that we don't even understand or understand where it came from. So it kind of comes down to a question of having an open information society, which you already talked about as well. Which you did talk about in your piece as well. And so I guess one question would be, we're an open society relatively. We're used to the idea that the people that we're talking to in our society are probably not just repeating a slew of talking points from a foreign government. And yet increasingly, whether it's with public figures or just average citizens, those of us, including you and I, who study this stuff, are noticing that that's exactly what's happening. So what do we do about that? We've got open societies. By the way, the places these are coming from are closed, right? And you talked about that. So what are your thoughts on what to do about kind of the inherent dichotomy there between open and more closed societies, and how one can insert things into the other?
Right. Well, so yeah, as you mentioned, both China and Russia, and I will repeat this because people watching this podcast may or may not have seen all of our
Sure.
past work,
Yeah.
but there is an ongoing alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And all of those societies are relatively closed information societies, right? So Iran maybe a little bit less, or previously was a little bit less so, but at this point,
But pretty controlled.
Post-revolution, quite controlled,
Yeah.
right? And so those countries are being led by authoritarian leaders who believe that maintaining control of their citizens will allow them to continue their leadership in perpetuity. And so what that means is that information from the United States has a really hard time getting in and infiltrating. They can control what their people are talking about, what their people are saying, especially online, a little bit harder to do behind closed doors, but makes it very hard to organize or protest or, orchestrate any kind of revolution when you're being constantly surveilled and monitored, like as far as what you're saying. So in the US, we still have the surveillance problem, clearly, but it's not necessarily, you're not going to go to jail for posting something on Facebook, right? You're not going to be thrown into prison or disappeared or that's an open information society, relatively speaking. And so
we have laws and protections, in other words. So while laws get broken, there are often consequences for that. And that's why, journalism is important, right? Because sometimes people overstep in Western governments that are in democratic societies that protect free speech, and they overstep on surveillance. Sometimes they overstep on free speech. And then there are court cases about it. And those courts actually are not beholden to the security apparatus that may have overstepped, right? So it's just a very different way that plays out.
That's how it's supposed to work, ideally. Yeah. And the US is not perfect by any means, but we have tried very hard over the years to protect that freedom to say whatever you'd like, even if it's
inconvenient to the current administration.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here, though, is that those closed information societies really understand the value of being closed, and they're doing it because they don't want us to do the same thing to them that they're currently doing to us.
Or even just to hear what we talk about.
Well, yes, they don't want their people to know. I mean, this is an interesting story, right? So in China, they had COVID lockdowns for a very long time. The reason that there were sudden protests by the Chinese people in China about these extreme COVID lockdowns was because they televised the World Cup in China. Those people saw that there were other people all over the world who were not under the same kinds of restrictive lockdowns, and then flooded the streets. They got angry that they were being told something that wasn't true. So there are direct political repercussions to that.
Yeah. So you were talking about the CRINC alliance, which we've talked about a lot: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and kind of the ways in which these closed societies are pumping misinformation into our societies, really pumping propaganda points into our societies that wind up in our national conversation without people understanding it. And I know for years things have been in kind of a shifting environment where a lot of those countries are changing their strategies, and you maybe talk a little bit about that, particularly, I think, as it applies to Russia and China, who are the biggest, just for our audience here, who are the biggest by far purveyors of weird narratives that they're purposefully inserting into other countries' national conversations.
Yeah, so the overall strategy hasn't changed too much. The overall strategy has always been and continues to be divide, polarize, demean the perspective of the United States by the eyes of its citizens, right? make people feel
Yeah,
like they're not
debase it,
proud
debase
to be part
democracy
of
and government.
to be part of this country, make people feel like they're not proud of their fellow people, make them angry, divide families, so that's the big picture strategy. But what we're seeing as far as from a tactics perspective is an evolution of tactics to evade detection online. So, in the 2016 election, primarily it was Russian interference. There was a very specific set of, bots on Twitter that were primarily being used to shape social media. There was a set of shadow propaganda sites that were being used to promote media content so that it would be then propagated through that social media network. Today, what we're seeing is a lot more advanced. So China and Russia are much more consistently retweeting each other, posting each other's perspectives and worldviews. They've done that in particular because when we banned RT in the United States, which was Russian propaganda, they lost a huge amount of reach. So China has been using its massive reach, because there's still a lot of US companies that are in China and focused on the Chinese market somehow, to continue to regain that on Russia's behalf. And they're promoting very specific narratives about things like the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. They're not calling it an invasion, they're calling it a special operation. So they're trying to promote this idea that it's a tactical thing. It's not actually an invasion. It's not an act of war. They're promoting this idea very consistently that, well, the United States has invaded countries in the past, and so therefore they're the real people behind this, right? The US participation in the Ukraine conflict is being portrayed as like another instance of getting involved in and
wipe the slate clean and act as though there was no aggressor and it's just more US
right,
intervention in some
right,
country.
exactly.
Deflect all blame from, So in other words, what I think from a broader perspective, what I think you're getting at is, in the past, when it came to online and kind of misinformation work, particularly the kind that hits the average person on their social media, I think that's what we're really talking about here. It sounds like, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the Russians were kind of the biggest player in the game, and the most active. And now I think it's true that back then the Chinese government, at least when they were using tools like that and using methods like that, were pretty discreet and pretty targeted. And it sounds like you're saying now they have much larger nets, botnets, et cetera, and they're targeting sort of the broader population now.
And they're also using more platforms, right? So that's the other thing. They're, whereas previously they were primarily focused on Twitter and Facebook in the US election, they're now trying to do this multi-platform approach. Like, they're creating videos on YouTube that they'll link to on Reddit to, push them forward. They're using TikTok for surveillance and I think kind of banning of phrases or words. There's a banned word list that was leaked from ByteDance a couple
I was trying to
months ago.
figure out what that even meant. It's tough because the wording is weird enough that you're going, well, that could mean a lot of things, but none of them are good, right?
Yeah, and in that kind of case, they're really trying to monitor what people are saying about China, like primarily, and censoring and pulling back influencer spread of threads that might be critical or criticizing China and the Chinese Communist Party. Particularly, they're sensitive to things like any mention of like the Uyghur population or concentration camps, and they're trying to promote Ukraine as Nazis, right? So they're really just trying to muddle all of the water. The other tactic that Iran has used that I think we're likely to see coming up in the next couple of years here in the United States, as China and Russia continue to be more coordinated and aggressive in their information warfare tactics, is they infiltrate specific networks of activists often, and then do things with fake accounts. And then do things to undermine those movements. Right. So Russia recently was caught, during the last election, Russia was caught hiring essentially Nigerians to and Ghanaians to run social media accounts posing as US citizens, trying to augment and polarize the Black community, trying to, the Black communities.
Well, and there was actually a legal case. I'm trying to remember because I don't want to get it wrong. So for now, I'll just say I can't recall. Maybe if we find it, we'll drop it in the chat for this. But there was actually a case in one of the DOJ, Department of Justice's cases, where they actually had evidence that a group had, staged events too. So staged a protest or staged a get together. And if I can get on with a fake set of, organizations online and stage events of any kind, right? Whether it's a protest and I just want to get you riled up and get you out there and cause an issue in some city in someone else's country, or if it's even worse, I'm creating an interest group, recruiting all those people that think that they're there talking to each other about their own problem in their own town, but they're actually just all getting together under the auspices of a foreign government who then goes, hey guys, I've got a great idea. Why don't we, target the local bank or something like that?
Right.
It gets into some pretty eerie gray zone warfare kind of territory, right?
I think, there's not public proof of this yet, but there is a lot of public proof that the Chinese and Russian misinformation efforts have directly targeted specifically woke culture, the Black community, gun violence. Anytime something
divisive, anything people have emotions
comes
about,
up, the George Floyd protests, and I would not be at all surprised. In fact, I would say I would be shocked if this hadn't happened. But the far right organization and the far right coordination and the January 6th attack, or attacks, maybe the wrong word, Capitol insurrection. I am positive, personally, as positive as one can be without direct evidence, that there was Russian involvement in those movements, right? Because those kinds of things are exactly the kinds of things that they've done before.
Because it meets the mission and it meets the tactics, right?
Exactly.
Where when you look at the things that they've been trying to do, when you look at internal documents that they have about what they're trying to achieve, and then you watch that play out around the world, and then you watch it play out
same
in another instance. It follows the playbook.
Yeah. And that's, if we're looking at today, what's going on in that space, like the entire backlash against like the conversations going on online about trans rights, about abortion, backlash about woke culture, all of that is being exacerbated and manipulated by these efforts. So I think
it tends to look, I agree that it tends to look, when you see the online conversations being had, it looks at face value like accelerated hatred and accelerated, ire.
Like they poured kerosene.
And then when you actually, so it is true that it is not difficult to go into those conversations on social media and start looking at who's posting. And if you know what you're looking for, you very quickly find bots. So I actually can definitively say I do this every day when I'm watching people scream at each other. And it's, often not even that hard to tell what's going on because they're pretty cheaply farmed bots. And so Dave, Dingus from Upside Down, Florida is not a very convincing profile. And you can find stuff kind of like that, where it's just like bare minimum at an American sounding name, and there's an American flag on their profile, and you'll even find the same bots saying polar opposite perspectives in different conversations, just right at the right moment, right?
In general, is these networks are often, if they're good and able to avoid detection, it takes actual humans to create these and for them to work well. Like we've moved beyond the point where automated accounts, like it's much easier for platforms to detect automated accounts. So they've moved actually to a more human-centered approach, which makes it harder to understand if you're dealing with an agent of misinformation who's paid by the Russian government, or it's Bob, from Iowa, who's actually a steel worker.
And so I guess that leads us to really the last thing that we could even talk about here, which is, okay, we kind of know this is going on. What you're saying is that it's a question of information sovereignty, which I haven't heard before, and that it's worse than we know. And the real question is, what do we do about this? Because we can't recognize, as average people, we won't even necessarily know when we're not speaking to a fellow American or a fellow European. We'll just see the words, and if they're doing it right, it will be fluent in your own language, and it will try to convince you that someone just like you in your country or someone who's not like you in your country is saying either something you really like or something you really hate. What do we do about that?
I mean, there's a couple of things you can do about it. Number one, delete your TikTok account. Get off of TikTok. It's a direct tool of the
Conduit.
Chinese Communist Party. So just like get over it and delete it. Number two, I do think that there is an opening for, the internet and social media started off as this thing that's so amazing to be anonymous and you can be yourself. And sorry, my dog is entering the podcast. But I do think that there is a space, we may be moving more in the opposite direction, right? Because we've gotten to the point where the anonymity means you have no idea, right? You have no idea if you're talking to a generative AI or a bot or a human who's pretending to be another human. And so I do think that moving forward, social media companies that are able to actually verify and authenticate people are who they say they are, as far as, this person actually lives in the United States and, I've connected, done.
I know a lot of us pay a lot less mind these days to anonymous accounts, right?
Right.
Because it's like, what's the point? If you're going to be, you may want to be anonymous on Twitter, but I do not have to listen to what you have to say because I have no idea who you are or if you even exist. Do you think that that's going to be a problem, though, when it comes to verification, the way you're describing? I think a lot of people like to be anonymous on the internet.
True. But I think there's going to be a bifurcation where those people who are anonymous, like you can set up social vouching systems, right? Where like, let's say I'm verified based on who, like I'm doing podcasts every week. I'm willing to be identified that this is really me. Ironically, Tinder they have a ton of bots, but like Tinder does this also. They will ask you for a photo, right? So they'll have you take a selfie to prove that it's actually you.
Well, and people end up meeting up in person, so there's a direct danger to their safety if there's a problem.
So there are ways to do this. There are ways that you can, Apple has everyone's fingerprint, right? So there are ways that we can do this, and I think it's going to become a network of like, how many trusted people are you connected to? How good are you at distinguishing between real people and fake people, right? Like that's going to be a skill set that will allow people to thrive. As far as like, what does the next generation of skills look like? Are you good at recognizing potential robots or computers or misinformation agents? It's probably a strategic advantage.
I wonder too if there's a way to get around the problem. I mean, I kind of wonder if that was the idea behind Twitter's. I think it probably was in part behind Twitter's where are you tweeting from, right? But it does help a lot of information warfare folks just when they're looking at, propaganda campaigns online. It's like, oh, well, this is sometimes it's lazy, right? And it's like, oh, a lot of this came directly out of Russia. But it's easy to spoof those things. I just wonder if there's going to be an arms race here at some point where it's like we kind of need to know that you're at least in the country or in on vacation, but usually posting from the country you claim to be living in, and that's just countrywide, so it's not such a big deal, right? Because I think a lot of people would prefer not to necessarily have some sort of big authentication ID system for using social media, but there are probably ways around that, like creative ways around that.
Well, and there are all kinds of reasons, like safety reasons, why there are sometimes we definitely wouldn't want to, people or places or situations where it would not be safe to share your identity, especially in those closed information societies. So I think what you're going to wind up with is like a series of, this person has confirmed their identity, right? Like I will show not TikTok my passport and to prove that I am an American citizen or my driver's license, right? It's like renting a car. You have to prove that you are who you say you are to have that kind of responsibility. And I think we're probably moving in that direction. You can, like, I could bring someone along in my car who doesn't have a driver's license or isn't willing to show someone their driver's license, but they're not going to be able to rent the car themselves, right? It's a little bit of
it sounds like there might be some technical solutions in there that would help to add a layer of removal between perhaps a social media company who's not someone you want to give your driver's license to, and
Right. You could have
the
a third
user,
party
right?
verification tool. I mean, you're always going to have issues with ownership, right?
Yeah.
Of those kinds of things.
Well,
Like
it's a sticky
23andMe.
topic, no matter
Right.
what.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Barrett. I think we got into the weeds at the end there, but hopefully in exactly the way that people like to think about and hear about. As you can tell, these are not simple problems. So it's been a pleasure to.
I'm giving this idea freely into the world. So if you would like to, if anyone out there is watching this podcast and they want to create an identity verification system that protects identities while verifying them and can be used across platforms, take the idea and build it.
Yeah, I think there might be some folks right now. I'm thinking of some companies that I've met before that either have already done it or are capable of doing it. And maybe the real question is like, can we convince people that that's worth doing, right? And again, to circle back, at the end of the day, what we're learning is that in the modern era with all this digital technology, you're kind of starting to give up your information sovereignty as a nation. And if you are just sitting around with your fellow citizens having the conversation that Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping decided you should have that day, that's probably not great. So, all right, Bear, thank you so much for your time. This has been very interesting as per always. I'm looking forward to talking more.